In 1964, Oldsmobile built a two-seat sports car and canceled it after exactly one model year without saying a word about why. No press release, no dealer bulletin, no explanation. It just vanished from the lineup the following year like it had never existed. It took historians 30 years to piece together the real reason, and once you hear it, you'll understand why Oldsmobile wanted this story buried. Quick, name an Oldsmobile in the 1960s. You probably said Cutlass, maybe 442. If you're a real enthusiast, maybe Toronado. Almost nobody says Jetstar I. And that's exactly the point of this video, because the Jetstar I might be the most significant Oldsmobile most people have never heard of. Here's what made it strange from the start. Oldsmobile in 1964 built a genuine two-seat sports car, not a two-door coupe with a back seat nobody uses, an actual two-seater, in an era when two-seater cars in America were basically a category of exactly one, the Corvette. Ford hadn't even launched the Mustang yet. That came a few months later in the spring of '64. For a brief window, Oldsmobile had a two-seat sporting car on sale, and almost nobody was competing directly with it. Under the hood, the Jetstar I came with a 330 cubic inch V8, positioned as a genuine performance offering rather than a dressed-up commuter car. It carried a price tag of $3,592, putting it in direct territory with the Ford Thunderbird. Oldsmobile wasn't trying to build a cheap curiosity. They were trying to build a legitimate personal sports car aimed at an established, profitable market. And then, after one single model year, it was gone. No second act, no running changes to try to save it, just silence. Beyond the two-seat layout, the Jetstar I was styled to stand apart from the rest of Oldsmobile's 1964 lineup. It shared its basic structure with the full-size B body cars, but the interior treatment was noticeably more driver-focused, a bucket seat-only cabin, a full-length center console running between the seats, and a dashboard laid out with more gauges than a typical Oldsmobile buyer would have seen in a Cutlass or a Dynamic 88. It even carried unique badging and trim details, meant to visually separate it from anything else on the Oldsmobile lot, signaling to buyers that this wasn't a trim package, it was its own model. That positioning mattered because it meant Oldsmobile wasn't hedging. They weren't testing the two-seat sports car concept quietly with a badge-engineered trim level they could walk back without consequence. They committed real tooling, real marketing language, and a genuinely distinct identity to this car. That level of commitment is part of why the sudden, silent cancellation stands out so sharply against how confidently the car had been introduced just 12 months earlier. At launch, the Jetstar I's closest rival on paper was the Ford Thunderbird, which by 1964 had grown into a four-seat personal luxury car, rather than a two-seater it started as back in 1955. That left an interesting gap in the market. Buyers who wanted the two-seat purity of an early Thunderbird, but with modern 1964 styling and a big-inch V8, had almost nowhere else to go besides the far more expensive Corvette. The Jetstar I slotted directly into that gap, at a price close enough to the Thunderbird that cross-shopping between the two would have made obvious sense. That's part of what makes the story so puzzling on the surface. The Jetstar I wasn't launched into a market with no obvious customer. It was launched into a real, definable gap between the Corvette above it and the four-seat personal luxury cars below it. A car with genuine market logic behind it doesn't usually get killed after 1 year purely because of soft sales, which is exactly why historians eventually stopped looking at the showroom floor for answers and started looking inside Oldsmobile's own product planning offices instead. This is where most car history videos would just shrug and say, it didn't sell well. These things happen. But that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny, and it never satisfied the people who actually dug into Oldsmobile's internal records. Think about it. From a business standpoint, automakers don't usually kill a brand new model concept after 12 months unless something is seriously wrong. Either the car is a catastrophic failure or something else, something structural is going on behind the scenes. A slow first year is normal. A slow first year for an entirely new product in a new segment is expected. Companies typically give a concept like this 2, 3, sometimes 4 years to find its footing before pulling the plug. Oldsmobile didn't wait. They pulled it after 1. And here's the detail that should really catch your attention. There was no public explanation. Not a line in Motor Trend, not a quote in Car Life, no dealer memo explaining the decision. In an era when automakers were relatively open about model lineup changes, even bad ones, the complete silence around the Jetstar I's cancellation is itself a piece of evidence. Silence in corporate history is rarely an accident. It's usually a choice. So what actually happened? To understand it, historians had to go looking in a place most casual fans never think to check: internal engineering and product planning documentation, rather than sales brochures or advertising. The breakthrough came from cross-referencing Oldsmobile production records held at the GM Heritage Center against the engineering development timeline for an entirely different car that wouldn't reach showrooms for another 2 years. That car was the Toronado. Here's the timeline that historians eventually pieced together. The Tornado's front-wheel drive engineering program, a genuinely radical departure for an American automaker at the time, had already been in active development well before the Jetstar I's single model year even wrapped up. In fact, a technical paper on the Tornado's front-wheel drive system, later cataloged as SAE Paper 660350, describes engineering work that predates the Jetstar I's cancellation by roughly 2 years. That's not a coincidence of timing, that's overlap. Put those two facts side by side, and a very different story starts to emerge. One with nothing to do with the Jetstar I failing in the marketplace, and everything to do with what Oldsmobile's own product planners were building next. The Jetstar I and the Toronado were aimed at almost exactly the same customer. Someone who wanted a distinctive, sporty, personal Oldsmobile that stood apart from the mainstream Cutlass and 88 lineups. Oldsmobile's planning department knew the Toronado was coming. They knew it was going to be the company's flagship halo car, built around revolutionary front-wheel drive engineering that Oldsmobile desperately wanted to be the story of the mid-1960s. A modest, conventionally engineered two-seater with a strong first impression risks splitting that exact customer base right before the big, expensive, engineering showcase Toronado was ready to launch. In other words, the Jetstar I wasn't killed by buyers rejecting it. It was killed by Oldsmobile's own internal planning department, protecting the runway for a much bigger, much more important program that was still 2 years from release. A modestly successful two-seater competing for the same buyer's attention was a threat to the Toronado's launch narrative, and rather than risk any market confusion or internal resource competition, Oldsmobile simply removed the competition, quietly, without explanation, before anyone outside the company had the chance to ask why. That's not a failed product story. That's a corporate sabotage story, just one where the villain is the same company that built the car in the first place. Now, to be clear, this wasn't some smoking gun conspiracy with a memo that says, "Kill the Jetstar I to protect Toronado." Corporate decisions like this rarely leave that kind of evidence, and that's exactly why it took 30 years for anyone to connect the dots. What actually happened was simpler, and in some ways more telling. Oldsmobile just never talked about it. No internal retrospective, no acknowledgement in later company histories. The car was manufactured, sold for 1 year, and then treated as if it had never been part of the plan to begin with. That kind of institutional silence is itself a piece of evidence. When a company axes a car because of poor sales, they usually say so, even years later, because it didn't sell is an easy, forgivable explanation. When a company goes quiet instead, it's often because the real reason is more uncomfortable. In this case, an admission that a promising new product was sacrificed for internal strategic reasons, rather than because customers rejected it. Because so few were built and even fewer were kept, tracking down a genuine Jetstar I today isn't simple. Many were treated by later owners as just another full-size Oldsmobile, badged over or mixed into parts cars, without any awareness that the two-seat configuration made them a distinct one-year-only model. Verifying a real one means checking the VIN and body tag against Oldsmobile's documented 1964 production codes, confirming the original bucket seat two-passenger configuration, and ideally tracing a paper trail back through prior ownership. A surprising number of unrestored survivors turn out to be later reproductions or modified full-size Oldsmobiles dressed up to look like the real thing, so provenance research matters more here than with almost any other car of this era. So why should you care about a one-year Oldsmobile most people have never heard of? Two reasons. First, it's a genuinely important piece of overlooked automotive history. The Jetstar I represents a road Oldsmobile could have kept walking down, a conventional V8-powered two-seat American sports car in the exact window before the Mustang redefined what an affordable sporty car could be. If Oldsmobile had kept developing it instead of shelving it to protect the Toronado, there's a real argument that Oldsmobile, not Ford, could have owned a meaningful piece of the personal sports car conversation for the rest of the decade. Second, and this is the part that matters if you're actually looking to own one, the Jetstar I is dramatically undervalued for what it is. A one-year-only American production car with a documented, genuinely interesting internal corporate story behind its disappearance currently trades in the range of $12,000 to $22,000 depending on condition and originality. Compare that to other one-year-only American performance cars from the same era, many of which command significantly higher prices purely because their scarcity story is better known. The Jetstar I has the scarcity. It has the story. What it's been missing is the awareness. And awareness is usually the thing that moves a car's value the most once collectors catch on. The 1964 Oldsmobile Jetstar I didn't fail. It was quietly retired to clear the runway for a bigger, more important car that Oldsmobile wasn't ready to talk about yet. For 30 years, that story sat buried in production schedules and engineering papers that almost nobody bothered to cross-reference. Now that it's out, the question isn't whether the Jetstar I deserves a place in automotive history. It's why more people haven't already started looking for one.